are you looking at him like that?
Before this story starts, I need you to stop right now. Whatever you were doing before you clicked on this video, put it down. Because what you are about to hear is not a summary. It is not a list. It is not the version of history they handed you in a classroom and expected you to forget by Friday. This is the full story, the cinematic version. The one with the silences and the stares and the conversations that happened behind closed doors that changed the direction of American history. And it starts, as the most dangerous things always start, with a woman who could not look away. Hit subscribe right now. Not because I'm asking, because by the time this story ends, you will want to be here when we tell the next one. And the one after that. Like the video, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Lagos, London, Houston, Kingston, wherever you are, I want to know. Because the people who find this channel are not ordinary people, and you are about to prove it. Now, the story you are about to hear is about a man named Frederick. A man so composed, so intelligent, so quietly and completely himself that the world built to contain him could not figure out what to do with him. So they sold him, and the man who bought him made the single worst mistake of his life. This is that story, and it starts with a stare. The afternoon had settled over the Chesapeake shoreline like a held breath. Not the violent heat of full summer, not the kind that arrived with thunder and drama and cracked the sky open. This was the slower, more patient heat of a Maryland spring that had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that it was already July. The air sat thick and golden over the tobacco rows. The distant water of the bay caught the light and held it, silver and still, through the breaks in the tree line. And the Lloyd Plantation, one of the largest in Talbot County, hundreds of acres of cultivated land surrounding a great house whose white columns were designed to communicate, to anyone who looked at them, the permanent and unquestionable nature of the power they represented, moved at the careful pace of a machine that had been running for decades and intended to keep running. On the wide front porch of that great house, 4 women sat in the arrangement of a Thursday afternoon visit. 2 were in cane-backed chairs, glasses of sweet tea sweating in their hands. 1 stood near the far railing, looking out toward the bay with the distracted expression of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. And the 4th, Mrs. Harriet Wyndham, wife of a tobacco merchant from Easton, a woman of 40 who had attended dozens of these afternoon visits and knew how they were supposed to go, had been in the middle of a sentence about the price of imported linen. She stopped speaking. Her companion, Mrs. Clara Pendleton, whose husband managed one of the Lloyd properties, noticed the silence first. Harriet? No response. Mrs. Wyndham's eyes had left the conversation entirely. They had moved, without her deciding to move them, to a fixed point somewhere out past the left railing of the porch. Down in the workyard, or where the enslaved men were moving between the barn and the equipment sheds in the ordinary rhythms of a Thursday afternoon, carrying tools, steering mules, doing the 100 unremarkable tasks that kept an estate this size alive. Mrs. Pendleton followed the line of her gaze, and then she too went quiet. What they were looking at was a young man crossing the yard. He was perhaps 15. Lean, not yet fully grown into whatever he was going to be in his body. He was not the largest man in the yard, not the oldest, not the most physically imposing by any measure. But there was something in the way he moved, something in the line of his spine, the angle of his shoulders, the quality of his face, that was, in the context of everything surrounding him, deeply and almost disturbingly out of place. He moved like a man who was thinking, not the task-focused, mechanical movement of someone carrying grain or leading a mule. He moved with the unhurried interior quality of a person whose mind was engaged with something, turning it over, examining it, filing it away. And his eyes, when they lifted from the path in front of him, did not have the reflexive, downward-angled quality that was, in this county, in this year, under this system, the expected posture of a young enslaved man near the great house. They were level, steady, observant in a way that made the word feel insufficient. "Who is that?" Mrs. Wyndham asked, low, almost to herself. "That's one of the houseboys," Mrs. Pendleton said. "Frederick, I think. Bailey. He belongs to Captain Anthony's estate. The old family manages him now. How old is he?" 15, maybe just turned 16. Mrs. Pendleton paused. Why? Mrs. Wyndham did not answer immediately. She was watching Frederick cross the far end of the yard toward the equipment shed, where an older man was bent over a broken harness. Frederick stopped beside him, said something. The older man responded, and Frederick listened. But as he listened, his eyes moved. Slowly, methodically, to the shed door, to the road beyond the fence line, to the great house itself. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was looking at everything. And then, as if he felt the specific gravity of two women watching him from a porch 40 feet away, he looked up. His gaze found Mrs. Wyndham's. He held it. 1 full second. Counted and deliberate. Long enough to be a choice. Short enough to stay within the boundary of what this world would permit. And then he looked back at the man with the harness and said something else, quiet and unhurried, as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Wyndham exhaled. "Harriet," her companion said carefully, "you've gone quite pale." "I'm fine." But her hand had found the arm of her chair, and she was gripping it. She was not frightened. Not exactly. She was unsettled. The way a person is unsettled when something they have always taken as fixed and permanent reveals, just for a moment, that it is neither. "He looked at me," she said quietly. "He works here, Harriet. He was simply—" "Not the way a boy looks at a passing thing," Mrs. Wyndham said. "He looked at me the way a lawyer looks at evidence." The porch went quiet. None of the 4 women said what they were all thinking. But something had shifted in the afternoon. Something small and irreversible, like the first crack in ice that is still holding, but has already decided it won't hold much longer. They had no idea what they had started. It happened again. This time, the occasion was a Sunday dinner at the Lloyd estate. A larger gathering. A dozen people around a long table, the conversation moving through the topics that comprised the social world of Talbot County's planter class. Crop prices, shipping contracts, the weather, the behavior of various neighbors. Frederick had been stationed near the sideboard to assist with serving. He did not move unnecessarily. He did not speak unless addressed. He stood with the correct posture and the correct expression. Present, available, invisible, in the way that the role required. But Mrs. Josephine Carver, the wife of a county judge who was seated at the far end of the table, I had been watching him for the better part of 20 minutes. She was not obvious about it. She had the social training of a woman raised in the Maryland gentry. She knew how to observe without appearing to observe. How to direct her gaze while seeming to be looking at something else entirely. But her husband noticed anyway. He leaned toward her slightly. "Josephine, I know," she said under her breath. "You've been staring at that boy for half an hour." "I have not been staring. You have not heard a word I've said since the soup." She picked up her glass, set it down. "There's something strange about him, Robert. Don't you feel it? He's standing at the sideboard, but he's not there. His mind is somewhere else entirely. You can see it." Judge Carver looked at Frederick briefly, and with the practiced disinterest of a man in his position, then looked back at his wife. "He's a boy, doing his work." "He is not simply doing his work," Mrs. Carver said, and something in her voice, not romantic, not inappropriate, but genuinely unsettled, made her husband set his fork down and look at her more carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, keeping her voice beneath the table conversation, "that when Colonel Lloyd spoke about the new contracts, the legal language he used, that boy's eyes moved. The way a person's eyes move when they're following something, when they understand something." She paused. "Robert, that boy understood what Colonel Lloyd was talking about." A silence between them. Then her husband turned, more slowly this time, and looked at Frederick again. And this time he did not look away immediately, because his wife was correct. There was something, some quality of attention, of presence, that was, in the context of where they were and who they were looking at, deeply and profoundly out of place. By the end of the evening, 3 separate women at that dinner had made remarks, not to their husbands, to each other, in the particular half language of women in that social world who are saying serious things through careful indirection. "He carries himself strangely. Did you notice his eyes? I don't know how to describe it. He's just different." These words moved through Talbot County's social network with the efficiency and the damage of smoke. Thomas Auld heard about the market incident on a Tuesday evening. He heard it the way men in his position always heard the most damaging things. Not directly, not in a conversation that he was part of, but through the careful silence of his neighbor Harkins, who had been told by his wife, who had been present. Frederick had been sent to Eastern Market alone, with a cart and a list, a routine errand. He had completed it without incident, in the strictest operational sense of the phrase. But a woman named Mrs. Albright, wife of the Presbyterian minister, a woman of unimpeachable social standing and absolutely no history of dramatic statements, had watched Frederick move through the market stalls for 10 minutes and then turned to the woman beside her and said with complete seriousness, "That young man from the old household. There is something going on inside him that nobody around him can see." The woman beside her, who was Harkins's wife, had not forgotten it, and Harkins, sitting across from Thomas Auld on a Tuesday evening with a glass of whiskey and the careful manner of a man deciding how much of a thing to say, eventually said enough. Thomas Auld sat with it for a long time after Harkins left. He sat in his parlour in the dark, the candle burning low, the house quiet around him, and he turned the problem over, the way a man turns something over when he already knows the answer, but is looking for a reason to arrive at a different one. It was not any single incident, that was the thing. It was not Mrs. Wyndham on the porch, or the Sunday dinner, or the market. It was the pattern, the consistency, the fact that in 3 separate environments, across 3 weeks, among women who did not know each other and had no reason to coordinate, the same report was coming back. That boy is not where you think he is. And in Talbot County, Maryland, in 1832, a young enslaved man who was not where you thought he was, who existed somehow in a different register from the role assigned to him, was not a curiosity. He was a problem. Thomas Auld refilled his glass. He thought about Hugh, about Baltimore, about the harbour city with its noise and its commerce and its shipyards and its... He stopped that thought before it finished. He thought about the women, about Mrs. Wyndham's pale face, about Mrs. Carver's voice when Harkins's wife described it. He understood what Colonel Lloyd was talking about. He thought about what that meant, and then he made his decision. The candle went out. Thomas Auld sat in the complete dark of his parlour for a long time. Then he went to bed. By morning, the arrangements were made. Frederick was going to Baltimore. As the morning was grey and cold when Thomas Auld's footsteps came down the path, Frederick was in the woodshed, splitting kindling. He had been up since before first light, not because he was required to be, but because the early hours before the household woke were the only hours that genuinely belonged to him. The quiet, the dark, the space in which his mind could move without the constant low-level performance that daylight required. He heard the footsteps and kept the axe moving. Steady, rhythmic. Because the worst thing, the thing he had understood since he was small enough to learn it, was to let a person know that you had heard them coming. Thomas Auld stopped at the shed entrance. Frederick set the axe down and turned. "Sir?" Thomas Auld looked at him in the particular way he always looked at him, the searching, a slightly frustrated look of a man trying to locate something that was not on the surface and never had been. He was already in his coat. He had not slept much. Frederick could see it in the redness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. "You're going to Baltimore," Auld said, "to Hugh's household. Today." Frederick said nothing for a moment, just held the man's gaze with the composed, cooperative expression that gave away nothing. "Yes, sir." Thomas Auld studied him. "You'll work for Hugh. Do what you're told. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." Another moment of searching, looking for the crack, the reaction, the thing underneath. There was nothing to find. There never was. Auld turned and walked back toward the house. Frederick picked up the axe, split the last 3 pieces of kindling, each one clean, even, as if nothing had happened. Then he put the axe down, and in the privacy of the empty shed, in the grey morning silence, he let himself breathe. Baltimore. They thought they were removing a problem. They had no idea, not the faintest understanding, that they were opening a door. Hold on. Right here. This man is 15 years old. He has been transferred like a piece of furniture because the women around him cannot stop noticing that he is more than what they have been told he is. And his response to every single one of these decisions made above his head is to breathe and think and file it away. If this story already has you leaning forward, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. And if you have not subscribed, do it now. Because we are not even close to the part where everything falls apart for the people who thought they were in control. Let's keep going. Baltimore arrived like a fist opening. After the flat, contained world of Talbot County, the tobacco rows, the silence, the great house sitting back behind its avenue of trees, as if it had grown there like a natural feature of the landscape. The city hit Frederick with everything at once. Sound, smell, motion. The dense, tangled streets of Fells Point pressed close on both sides, cobblestones slick with salt water and horse, and the industrial residue of a working harbour. Shipyards on both sides of the water's edge, the sound of caulking hammers constant as a heartbeat. Counting houses and warehouses and taverns stacked against each other without ceremony. Men moving in every direction with the particular purposeful urgency of a city that was, in 1832, growing faster than it could contain itself. Frederick stood at the edge of the wharf and looked at it. He was not overwhelmed. He was cataloguing. Hugh Auld's house was on Philpott Street, a narrow row house a few blocks from the water, kept orderly and tight in the manner of a man who had made himself through discipline and intended to communicate that fact through every surface of his environment. Hugh himself was a ship caulker by trade, now prosperous enough to employ others, sharp, practical, quicker to irritation than Thomas, but also in some important ways less attentive. His mind lived in commerce, in contracts, in the daily machinery of a harbour economy. He did not spend long evenings in his parlour trying to locate the thing behind Frederick's eyes. His wife Sophia was different. Sophia Auld had not been raised in a slave-holding household. She came from a family where people were simply people, where the legal architecture of ownership had never been part of her daily emotional landscape. And so, when she opened the door of the Philpott Street house and found a 15-year-old boy standing on her step with a single bundle and a face of complete, unemotional composure, she simply saw a child. A serious, watchful, clearly exceptional child who was, whatever the law said about him, possessed of a mind that was doing things she recognized. She showed him the house, explained his duties, made him a meal, and, without asking anyone's permission, she spoke to him the way she would have spoken to any person who was present in her home. It took 3 weeks for the first lesson to happen. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at that late October angle, warm and almost horizontal, turning everything it touched briefly golden, when Sophia Auld sat down at the kitchen table and opened her Bible. Frederick was stacking dishes on the shelf above the stove. He turned at the sound of the chair. "Come sit," she said. He sat across from her, carefully, the way he did everything, with the controlled economy of a person who had learned that unnecessary movement invited unnecessary attention. Sophia turned the Bible so it faced him, pointed to the top of the page. "These marks are letters," she said. "Each one makes a sound. See this one? That's an A. Like the sound at the beginning of the word apple." Frederick looked at the letter. He already knew it. He had been collecting letters for months, from the sides of crates at the market, from discarded newspaper pages blowing in the Fells Point gutters, from the chalked labels on barrels at the shipyard. He had a private alphabet already, assembled piece by piece like a man collecting tools for a job he had not yet been permitted to start. But Sophia Auld did not know that. And Frederick, understanding the value of what was being offered, said nothing about what he already knew. He listened as if each letter were entirely new. He asked careful questions, not too many, not too quickly. He let the lesson move at her pace. Because this was not just a lesson about letters. This was a relationship. And relationships, he had understood since early childhood, were the most important infrastructure a person in his position could build. "Can you say it back to me?" Sophia asked. "The A sound?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, and repeated it perfectly. She smiled. The uncomplicated, pleased smile of a teacher seeing a student understand something. "Good," she said. "We'll do the whole alphabet today if you'd like." "I would like that very much," Frederick said. And the lesson began. Hugh Auld came home on a Thursday evening to the sound of his wife's voice. He set his coat on the hook, stood in the hallway, listened. She was reading aloud. No, she was following something being read aloud. He could hear the rhythm of it. Someone reading a paragraph from a news article about harbour shipping, and the words coming with a smoothness and gathering confidence that did not belong to a person still fighting the basic mechanics of literacy. Hugh walked to the kitchen doorway. Frederick was at the table, the newspaper open in front of him, reading. Sophia looked up. Her expression shifted, not guilty exactly, but aware. She started to say something. Hugh held up his hand. "Frederick," he said quietly, "go to your room." Frederick folded the newspaper, rose from the table, walked past Hugh in the doorway, with the same composed, unrevealing expression he always wore. When his footsteps had reached the upper floor, Hugh Auld turned to his wife. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the contained, deliberate tone of a man converting fear into authority in real time. "You cannot teach him to read, Sophia." "Hugh, he's bright. Well, he wants to learn. There is no harm in—" "There is every harm." He moved to the table, sat across from her where Frederick had been sitting. "Listen to me carefully. A literate slave is not just a problem. He is a different category of problem entirely. A man who can read can write a pass. Do you understand what that means? He can write his own permission to travel. He can read legal documents. He can read abolitionist newspapers. And there are plenty of those circulating in this city. He can correspond with people we cannot see. Hugh." "Sophia." He leaned forward. His voice dropped lower. "The moment you put a book in that boy's hands, you make him unfit for the condition he is in. And a man who knows he is unfit for his condition does not accept it quietly. He fights it. And when he fights it, everyone around him pays the price." "Do you understand me?" A silence in the kitchen. "No more lessons," Hugh said. "Not one more. Do you understand me?" Sophia said nothing. Hugh read her silence correctly. "I'm serious about this." "I understand you," she said at last, quietly. Hugh rose, straightened his coat, walked back to the hallway. Upstairs, in the small room at the back of the house, Frederick Bailey sat completely still on the edge of his bed. He had heard every word. He had listened to Hugh Auld explain, with the precise and urgent clarity of a genuinely frightened man, the exact mechanism of his own vulnerability. He had heard the wall described from the inside, its height, its purpose, the specific threat it was designed to contain. He sat with this for a long time. And then he did the thing he always did with information. He filed it. "They are afraid of exactly one thing," he thought. "The one thing they will not give me. Which means it is the one thing I cannot afford not to have." He lay back on the bed in the dark. He was not angry. He was certain. The lessons from Sophia would stop. But the education, the real education, the one that could not be switched off because it lived entirely inside him, had already begun. And he had just received its most important lesson yet. Not from Sophia, from Hugh. They had no idea what they had just done. The street boys of Fells Point were 9 and 10 years old, loud and dirty, and perpetually underemployed in the hours between school and supper. And they were, without knowing it, the most important teachers Frederick Bailey would ever have. He found them in the alleys off Thames Street and the open ground near the shipyard fence. He came to them with bread, saved from his own meals, a currency that small boys understood completely, and a challenge. "I can write a letter," he said. "I bet you can't write one I don't know." They always took the bait, and every time they wrote a letter to show him, they taught him the ones he did not yet have. He collected them. He added them to the private alphabet he carried in his mind, slotting each new piece into the structure that was growing, day by day, into something that could carry real weight. He found a copybook in a trash heap outside a schoolhouse on Fells Street, waterlogged at one corner, half the pages already used, and he practiced his letters in it in the pre-dawn darkness of the shed behind the old house, tracing the shapes first with his finger on the blank inside of the cover, and then with a stub of charcoal on the pages themselves. When every page was full, he wrote between the old lines. When the margins were gone, he practiced on the boards of the shed wall, on the backs of his own hands, washing them clean before coming back inside. He discovered that the shipyard where Hugh hired him out as a caulker's assistant was covered in markings. Every piece of timber was labelled with a letter, marking its position in the frame of a ship under construction. The ship carpenters chalked letters on everything automatically, as naturally as breathing. Frederick watched them, memorized the letters, understood the system. At 15 years old, working in the noise and salt smell of a Baltimore shipyard, he was conducting a graduate-level seminar in code breaking and extracting from every available surface the information he needed, assembling it into a structure he was building entirely alone. And then he found the book. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he saw it in the window. The Columbian Orator, a collection of political speeches and dialogues used in schools to teach young men the art of argument. Frederick stood outside the window and looked at the spine for a long time. 50 cents. The price was marked in chalk on the small board beside it. 50 cents that he had been accumulating for 3 months. Small coins from errands, from the occasional tips pressed into his hand by men at the docks, from the careful and almost painful discipline of a person who was saving towards something he could not yet name. He went in, put the coins on the counter, picked up the book. He walked back to Philpott Street, holding it under his arm with the careful, unhurried pace of a person who has just acquired something extraordinary and knows better than to show it. That night, in the dark of his room, he opened it for the first time. He read a speech by a Roman senator demanding citizenship rights for the people of Italy. He read an essay on the natural rights of man. And then he found the dialogue, the one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A conversation between an enslaved man and his master, in which the enslaved man systematically dismantles every moral justification his master offers for the institution that holds him. Argument by argument, patiently, without raising his voice. And the master, confronted with each argument in turn, unable to answer any of them, falls silent. Frederick read it 3 times that first night. He lay back in the dark with the book closed on his chest and stared at the ceiling. He understood something now that he had sensed for years but never had language for. The system that held him was not invincible because it was right. It was not powerful because it was just. It was powerful because it controlled who got to speak, who got to read, who got to make the arguments, and who was required to stay silent. Give a man the words and the logic and the space to make the argument, and the argument could not be answered. He already had the logic. He had been building it since the woodshed, since the porch at Lloyd's Plantation, since the moment he first understood that the world around him was operating on rules that did not make sense, that the people enforcing those rules could not defend them if challenged, and that the only thing preventing the challenge was silence. He was not going to be silent, but he needed more. He needed every tool, every word, every mechanism of the language in which this world conducted its business. He read the Columbian Orator until the binding softened, until the pages fell open naturally at every speech, until he had memorized the arguments so thoroughly that he could deliver them in any order, from any point, responding to any objection. And then he went looking for more books. By the time Frederick was 17, he was running a school. It met on Sunday mornings, the one day when the surveillance of the working week relaxed, in the back room of a free black man named Charles Lawson's house on Happy Alley. It called itself a Sabbath school because a group of black people gathered for religious purposes on a Sunday morning was not, on its surface, suspicious. What it actually was a literacy operation. Frederick stood at the front of that room, sometimes 10 people, sometimes 20, men older than him, women, free and enslaved, and taught. He taught the alphabet. He taught people to sound out words, to decode the legal documents and travel passes and contracts that governed their daily lives. He taught them to read the newspapers and understand what was being decided about them in rooms they were not permitted to enter. He was 17 years old, He was one of the most effective organizers in Baltimore. And every single person in that room left knowing something that the people who had arranged Frederick's life had spent years trying to prevent them from knowing. It could not last forever. And it didn't. They came on a Sunday morning with the aggressive energy of people who have organized themselves around a grievance. Someone had talked. It didn't matter who. The result was the same. A group of white men at Charles Lawson's door, dispersing the school, threatening everyone present, taking names. The news reached Thomas Auld through the network of neighbor conversations that had, 2 years earlier, brought Frederick to Baltimore in the first place. But this time, what came back was different. Not that Frederick had been learning to read. Thomas Auld had suspected that for years, but that Frederick had been teaching others. That changed the entire calculation. Thomas Auld sent for him immediately. The room smelled of pipe smoke and the particular staleness of a house in which the windows were not opened often enough. Frederick stood on one side of the room. Thomas Auld stood on the other. There was a long silence. The kind in which both men were deciding something. "You've been running a school," Auld said at last. "I have been teaching reading," Frederick said. "That is not permitted. You are aware of that." "Yes, sir." "Look at me." Auld waited. "Why? Tell me why you would do this when you knew the consequence." Frederick met his eyes, held them with the steady, composed regard that had been unsettling people in this county since he was 15 years old. "Because people wanted to learn," he said. Simple, even, giving nothing extra. Thomas Auld stared at him for a long moment. There was something in his face in that moment, something beyond anger, beyond calculation, that was closer to genuine bewilderment. The look of a man confronting a thing his framework could not account for. "I don't know what to do with you," he said. It came out before he intended it to. Frederick could see that. Could see the slight shift in Auld's face as he heard his own words and realized he had said too much. But it was true. And they both knew it. Thomas Auld could not manage Frederick through ordinary fear because Frederick had long since looked at fear directly and decided it was insufficient reason to stop. He could not manage him through deprivation because Frederick had demonstrated over and over the ability to build what he needed out of whatever was available. For he could not manage him through isolation because Frederick, wherever he was placed, became a center of gravity around which others organized. He needed someone else. He needed the one tool he had not yet tried. He needed a man who did not simply hold people. He needed a man who broke them. "You're going to Covey's farm," Thomas Auld said. Something moved, very briefly, across Frederick's face, gone before it could be named. "Yes, sir," he said. What happened next was the most important mistake Thomas Auld ever made. "I need you to stay here for just a moment." Thomas Auld looked at this young man, this extraordinary, composed, quietly devastating young man. And the best solution he could find was to send him to someone whose entire profession was destroying the thing inside a person that made them who they were. But he was about to find out whether that was possible. If this story is doing something to you, if your chest is tight right now, drop a comment. Tell me what you're feeling. I read every single one. And share this video with one person tonight. One person who needs to hear this story. We are going into the darkest part now. Stay with it. The farm of Edward Covey sat on the eastern edge of a low stretch of land 7 miles from St. Michael's. It was not a prosperous farm. It was not meant to be. Covey was not a wealthy man, and the farm reflected that a few spare acres, some cattle, a handful of pigs, outbuildings that were functional rather than maintained. The whole place had the feel of something that existed not to produce comfort, but to produce a specific result. That result was compliance. See, Covey had built his reputation not on land or commerce, but on the specific and terrible science of his profession. Planters throughout the county who found their enslaved workers, in their language, difficult, sent them to Covey for a season. They came back changed. That was the guarantee. Not physically destroyed, necessarily. Not broken in ways that showed, but altered at some fundamental level. Quieter, smaller, operating within a narrower range of motion than before. His method was not primarily violence, though he was violent. His method was exhaustion. He worked the people on his farm from before first light to after full dark, every day, without variation. He appeared at random, behind hedges, around barn corners, at the edge of fields, watching, always watching, and for the small defiances of pace and posture that a man exhibits when he believes himself unobserved. And he punished these moments not with fury, but with absolute humorless consistency. The message was not, "I will hurt you." The message was, "You are never alone. There is no moment that belongs to you. There is no space in which you exist outside of my observation." Frederick arrived on January 1st. He stood in the frozen mud of the yard and looked at the farm, and began taking inventory. By summer, something was happening to him that he had not prepared for. He wrote about it later, years later, from a position of safety and accomplishment, with the kind of honesty that most men reserve for private journals and never let anyone read. He wrote about those months at Covey's farm without the protective softening of a man protecting his own legend. He wrote, "I was broken, not completely, not in the deepest place, the place where the decision lived, but on the surface, in the body, in the daily capacity to hold a thought past the end of the working day, in the quiet and continuous inner life that had been his most essential possession since childhood." Covey's method was working. The days were 16, sometimes 18 hours of unrelenting physical labor in the August heat. He hauled grain and hoed fields and repaired fencing and drove cattle and did the 100 brutal tasks of a work in Maryland farm without adequate food and without adequate rest. His body, which had never done this kind of work at this scale, was failing in small and then larger ways. His hands bled. His back stopped straightening fully by the 4th month. And the thoughts? The arguments he had been building. The careful structures of logic assembled from the Columbian orator and the stolen Baltimore mornings and the Sabbath school and the newspapers and the years of patient accumulation. They began to recede. Not disappear, but recede. Like something he could see in the distance, but could not walk toward, because there was no energy available for walking. This was the design. Frederick understood the design. That was the terrible part. He could, in the diminishing but not yet extinguished analytical core of himself, identify exactly what was being done to him and exactly how it worked. And he could not stop it from working. He wrote later, "I was sometimes prompted to take my life, but I was prevented by a combination of hope and fear." That sentence contains 6 months. The hope was irrational and small and absolutely necessary. The air was already thick at 6 o'clock. Frederick was in the barn, separating wheat from chaff with a hand fan, when he heard Covey's footsteps on the path outside. He kept working, because the first rule of survival on this farm was to be doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing at exactly the moment Covey arrived. Covey came through the barn door, did not speak, moved behind Frederick with the particular quiet of a man who had done this hundreds of times and had his own ritual of approach. Frederick felt him move. He turned, and something rose in him. from wherever it had been compressed and stored through 6 months of systematic depletion, with the sudden and total quality of a thing that has been held underwater and released. He grabbed Covey's arm. The sound Covey made was not anger. It was surprise. "Let go," Covey said. Low, controlled. The voice of a man recalibrating. Frederick did not let go. "Boy," Covey said. And his voice was different now, something moving through it that was not quite what it claimed to be. "You let go of me right now." "No, sir," Frederick said. 2 words. Quiet. Even. And in the context of where they were, in the context of every transaction this farm had ever conducted, those 2 words were as close to an earthquake as the English language could produce. They moved together across the barn floor. Not fighting, exactly. Not yet. But testing. Covey pulling. Frederick holding. The physical negotiation of 2 people discovering, in real time, what was actually true about the balance of force between them. Then Covey swung, and Frederick caught his arm. Another farmhand, a man named Hughes, came running at Covey's shout. Frederick turned, met him, drove him backward into the straw, with enough force that he sat down and stayed there, looking up with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary of what was supposed to happen on this farm. 2 hours. That was how long it lasted. 2 hours, in the close hot dark of a Maryland barn, in the middle of an August morning, a 17-year-old boy who had been systematically broken for 6 months, and the man whose entire professional reputation was built on the certainty that every person who came to his farm could be broken. When it was over, Edward Covey stepped back. He was bleeding from the ear. His shirt was torn at the collar. He was breathing in the careful, controlled way of a man assembling himself in front of a witness. He looked at Frederick. Frederick looked back. Steady. Not triumphant, not afraid. Simply present. More present than he had been in 6 months. Covey turned around and walked out of the barn. He did not send Frederick to jail. He did not have him flogged. He did not report the incident to Thomas Auld, because to report it would have required him to say it aloud. To a man who had paid for the guarantee. To a county that had built its social order on the certainty that Covey's method worked on everyone. So he said nothing. The rest of the season passed without incident. Covey never touched him again. And Frederick, standing in that barn in the August heat, and in the strange and absolute quiet after, felt the scaffolding return. Quietly, solidly, the architecture of himself, settling back into place like stone finding its level. He knew something now that he'd only believed before. He could not be broken. And that knowledge, that absolute, earned, embodied certainty, was the most dangerous thing Edward Covey had ever allowed to leave his farm alive. They had no idea what they had just confirmed. Thomas Auld brought Frederick back to Baltimore. This decision, made for reasons of practical management, because a man who had survived Covey without being broken was more visible and more volatile on a rural farm than in the anonymity of a city, was the final and decisive mistake in a long series of mistakes. Because Baltimore, to Frederick now, it was not the city it had been when he arrived at 15. It was a map. He worked at the Fells Point shipyards, hired out by Hugh Auld as a caulker. He was good at the work, fast, precise, technically skilled in ways that Hugh noticed and was pleased by. Hugh was making good money from Frederick's labor. He returned a small allowance to Frederick each week. He gave him some freedom of movement between the yard and the house. This was the mistake, not the money, not the work, the movement. It was an ordinary Tuesday when it happened. Frederick had been sent to the shipyard office with a message from the yard foreman, a routine errand, a folded paper to be delivered to the superintendent's desk if the superintendent was not present. The superintendent was not present. Frederick went to the desk, set the paper down. And then he saw what was on the desk. A stack of correspondence, letters, contracts, shipping manifests, legal documents, the ordinary paper infrastructure of a working maritime business. And on top, a printed form, a certificate, the kind used by free black sailors to document their status as free persons, used as identification when traveling between states. Frederick looked at it for a long time. He was alone in the room. He could hear the hammering from the yard outside, the shouts of the caulkers, the creak of timber, the ordinary sounds of a working day continuing without interruption. He looked at the certificate. Read every word of it. Read the language. The specific legal language describing a free black man's right to travel. The blanks where the name and physical description would be filled in, and the official stamps and signatures that gave the document its authority. He read it the way he read everything. Completely, precisely. Filing every element. He set it back down exactly as he had found it. Walked out of the office, went back to his work at the yard. And in the back of his mind, the document sat, fully memorized, fully understood, alongside everything else he had been collecting for 6 years. Hugh Auld had given him the movement. The movement had given him the knowledge. And the knowledge was the key that had been sitting in a lock he had spent years building. Her name was Anna Murray. She was a free black woman, daughter of formerly enslaved parents who had purchased their freedom before she was born. And she was serious and grounded and practically intelligent in the way of a person who has never had the luxury of being otherwise. She attended the same church. She came to the meetings of the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, where Frederick was still, quietly and carefully, continuing the work of the Sabbath school in a form less visible to the people who had shut the Sabbath school down. He told her everything, not immediately, not recklessly, over months of careful conversation, in the measured way of two people deciding together whether to trust each other with something irreversible. She listened. She asked exact, practical questions. Where would you go? New York first, then north. How? A sailor's disguise. Borrowed papers. She was quiet for a moment. I can get money, she said. I've been saving. He looked at her. Anna, I know what I'm risking, she said, and her voice was not dramatic about it. It was simply factual. I know what happens if you're caught and they trace it back to me. I know that. A pause. I'm still going to help you. She gave him money. She helped him find the sailor's uniform. She knew the plan completely, and she waited. Frederick dressed in the dark. The sailor's clothes. The borrowed papers describing a free black sailor. Imprecise in detail, sufficient in authority, enough to carry a composed and confident man through a single critical transaction. He stood in the room for a moment. 20 years old. 6 years of patient, systematic, methodical construction behind him. Every lesson from Sophia Auld. Every letter from the Fells Point Street Boys. Every page of the Columbian Orator. Every word of Hugh Auld's frightened speech, overheard through a kitchen floor. The Sabbath school, the barn at Covey's farm, the certificate on the superintendent's desk, all of it leading to this morning. He picked up his bag, walked out of the door of the old household on Philpott Street. Did not look back. The conductor moved through the colored car with the bored efficiency of a man who had done this journey 1,000 times. Frederick sat with his hands still in his lap, his bag between his feet, his face arranged in the particular expression he had perfected over years. Present, cooperative, belonging exactly where he was. The conductor stopped at his seat, looked at him, looked at the papers. "Sailor?" he said. "Yes, sir," Frederick said. The voice easy, the vocabulary precise. The manner of a working man of the sea who had been asked this question many times and found it only mildly interesting. The conductor looked at the papers again, looked at Frederick. A moment that lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable and not quite long enough to become a crisis. Then the conductor moved to the next seat. Frederick sat with his hands in his lap. Breathed. He arrived in New York in the morning. He found the home of David Ruggles, an abolitionist who ran a network for newly arrived fugitives. He sent a letter to Baltimore. Anna Murray came north within the week. They married in New York in the apartment of David Ruggles on a morning in September with 2 witnesses they had met 72 hours earlier. Then they moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And in New Bedford, Frederick Bailey ceased to exist. The man who walked out of that city and into the world was Frederick Douglass. The name taken from a character in a Walter Scott poem. Chosen because it was the name of a free man. The only thing he intended to be, from that morning forward, for the rest of his life. Stop here for just a moment. This man walked out of that house with borrowed papers and a borrowed name, and the accumulated knowledge of 6 years of systematic, patient, extraordinary self-education. And the men who had arranged his life, who had transferred him from county to county, from overseer to breaker, who had thought they were managing a piece of property, had no idea. Not one of them had any idea. Drop a comment right now. Just one word. The one word that describes this man. Because the reckoning, the part where they find out exactly what they did, is coming. And it is devastating. The convention hall was full. A gathering of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, predominantly white New England reformers, people of genuine moral conviction and considerable self-satisfaction about that conviction. They had come to hear speakers, to be moved, to have their existing commitments confirmed and deepened. William Lloyd Garrison was present, the most prominent white abolitionist in America, editor of The Liberator, a man who had spent decades in this movement and had heard every kind of testimony from every kind of person. Frederick Douglass stood up. He was 23 years old. He stood at the front of the room and he looked out at the audience with the level, steady regard that had been making people uncomfortable since he was 15 years old on the porch of the Lloyd Plantation. And he began to speak. He did not give them testimony. He gave them an argument. He spoke about the legal infrastructure of slavery, its relationship to the Constitution, its economic function in the national economy, the specific mechanisms by which it reproduced itself across generations. He spoke with the syntactical precision and rhetorical control of a man who had been studying the Columbian orator for 8 years and had spent the intervening time reading everything else he could find. He spoke the way a man speaks who has been rehearsing, in his mind and in rooms full of other people who needed to hear it, for his entire adult life. The room went very quiet. William Lloyd Garrison sat in his chair and did not move for the duration of the speech. When it was over, there was a silence before the applause that said more than the applause did. Garrison wrote in his journal that night. He had spent 40 years in public life. He had never heard anything like what he heard in that hall. Frederick Douglass was immediately offered a position on the abolitionist lecture circuit. He accepted, and then he went home and started writing. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was published in May of 1845. It was 125 pages. It named names. Thomas Auld, Hugh Auld, Edward Covey, The Lloyd Plantation, Talbot County. Every person, every place, every specific mechanism of the specific system in which the specific named individuals had participated. It was written in the controlled, devastating prose of a man who had been thinking about this book for 10 years and had made absolutely certain there were no exits. He anticipated the argument that his eloquence proved the narrative was fabricated, and he countered it inside the narrative itself, explaining in precise detail how he had learned to read and write, through what methods, at what age, in what circumstances. He left nothing for them to hide behind. The book sold 11,000 copies in 3 years. It was translated into French and Dutch. It was read in London and Dublin and Edinburgh. It was cited in parliamentary debates. It was placed in the hands of senators and foreign dignitaries and church leaders and ordinary people all over the English-speaking world. And Thomas Auld, farmer of St. Michael's, Maryland, who had stood in a dark parlour on a Tuesday night and decided that Baltimore was the solution, found his full name, his address, and a detailed account of his conduct as a slave owner in the most widely discussed book in the Atlantic world. He had paid for the education that wrote it. He had arranged the transfer to Baltimore that supplied the books and the teachers and the street boys and the copybooks and Charles Lawson's back room. He had sent Frederick to Covey, who confirmed, in the most definitive possible way, that he could not be broken. He had brought him back to Baltimore, where the final plan was laid, and Anna Murray was found, and the certificate on the superintendent's desk was memorized, and the sailor's clothes were obtained. Every decision, every transfer, every attempt at management and containment, each one, in the full accounting of history, a contribution to the man who exposed them all. That was the terrible mistake. Not one decision on one morning. The compounding catastrophe of a man who thought he was managing property, and was, from the very first afternoon that Frederick Bailey crossed the yard of the Lloyd Plantation, and a woman on a porch could not look away, funding a revolution. Edward Covey died in 1875. He died in the same county where he had built his reputation, in relative obscurity. The profession of slave breaking had become, along with the institution it served, a historical artifact. He left behind a farm, some debt, and the permanent historical distinction of being the man who spent 2 hours fighting a 17-year-old boy in a barn, and walked away, having lost the only thing that mattered. And Thomas Auld lived until 1880. In his final years, he received a letter. It came from Washington, D.C., written by a man who was, by that point, one of the most prominent Americans of the 19th century. A man who had served as advisor to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, who had been appointed United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, who had been received by heads of state in England, Ireland, France, whose books were in libraries on 3 continents, whose speeches had moved legislatures and changed the minds of people who had never expected their minds to be changed. The letter was from Frederick Douglass. It was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was written with the measured, composed authority of a man who had nothing left to prove and knew it. He described what his life had become. He described what had been possible once the door was opened. He asked Thomas Auld, now very old and very close to the end, to consider, fully and without evasion, the complete weight of what 40 years had contained. Thomas Auld, by all accounts, wept. Whether those tears represented genuine understanding, a real reckoning with what his decisions had cost and what they had ultimately produced, or simply the grief of an old man confronting the scope of his own history, is not something any of us can say with certainty. What can be said with certainty is this: the man who had arranged those transfers who had stood in a woodshed at dawn and said, "You're going to Baltimore," as if he were moving furniture, and who had sent a young man to a professional breaker because he could not figure out what else to do. That man spent the last years of his life being publicly and permanently associated with the story of the most extraordinary thing his property had ever done. He could not contain it. He never could have. There is something worth sitting with at the very end of this. The women of Talbot County, who had found Frederick's presence disturbing in ways they could not name, who had stared at him from porches and dinner tables and market stalls, who had said to their husbands and each other, "There is something going on inside him that nobody around him can see." They were right. They were seeing something true. Not the truth they thought they were seeing. Not danger in the way their framework understood danger, but the truth of a person who was already, at 15 years old, in the process of becoming someone whose name would be spoken in parliaments and whose books would be read in libraries 2 centuries after his death. Their discomfort was accurate perception. They simply had no framework in which to understand what they were accurately perceiving. Hugh Auld's speech, delivered in a kitchen to his wife, overheard through a floor by the person it most concerned, was the most important education Frederick Bailey ever received. Not because of what it taught him about letters, because of what it taught him about power. He explained the wall in such detail that he effectively drew a map of the door. Thomas Auld's decision to send Frederick to Covey was the decision that produced the August morning in the barn. And the August morning in the barn was the moment, documented in Frederick's own words with the precision of a man who understood its significance. When he stopped being a person enduring his condition and became, completely and permanently, a person who had decided to end it. "I was nothing before I resolved," he wrote. "I was everything after." Every mistake these men made, every transfer, every failed containment, every decision to use a different tool on a person for whom their tools had been designed without sufficient imagination, was a contribution to a mind that turned everything into information, to a person who had decided in the deep and quiet and unshakable place where real decisions are made, who he was going to become. No system, no matter how thoroughly designed, yet no matter how many generations it had operated without serious challenge, can contain a person who has made that decision. It can delay him. It can exhaust him. It can make the path so difficult that most people would stop walking it. But it cannot stop him, because a person like Frederick Douglass does not experience the obstacles they place in his path as obstacles. He experiences them as materials, and he builds with them. He built his freedom out of Sophia Auld's 20-minute alphabet lesson, and Hugh Auld's frightened kitchen speech, and the street boys of Fells Point, and the 50-cent book, and the Sabbath school, and the barn at Covey's farm, and the certificate on the superintendent's desk, and Anna Murray's savings, and a sailor's uniform, and a train conductor who looked at his papers for 3 seconds and moved on. No, he built it out of everything they gave him, and out of everything they tried to take away. That is the story. That is the mistake they made. And that is why, 200 years later, we are still talking about him. And they are footnotes in his story. I want you to sit with this for one moment before you scroll. Frederick Douglass did not escape because the system failed to try. The system tried extremely hard. It deployed isolation and violence and psychological depletion and legal authority and the most specialized professional it had available. He survived because he had decided, in the deep, unshakable, irrevocable way that changes everything, who he was going to be. And that decision was made before any of them fully understood what they were dealing with. The women on the porch saw it first and set everything in motion. Now, 3 things from you before you leave. First, subscribe right now. because we have more stories like this one. Stories about minds, about the long, patient, brilliant, devastating work of people who refused to accept the version of themselves that the world tried to impose. Stories they did not teach you in school. You do not want to miss them. Second, leave a comment. Tell me the one line from this story that you are going to carry with you. One line. I read every single comment on this channel. Every one. Third, share this video tonight. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because the most important history in the world is sitting in places people never look. And you just found one of those places. Send it forward. This channel exists because of you. And these stories exist because of them. Frederick Douglass did not whisper his way to freedom. He built it, piece by piece, word by word, decision by decision. In the dark, alone, with whatever he could find. We honor that by telling it the way it deserves to be told. We will see you in the next one.